things on the docket for tonight are going to be going through Chapter 10 and 11. Because with our schedule, we want to make sure that we have enough time to prepare ourselves for the next chapter as well, the cardiovascular chapter. Because the cardiovascular chapter is a big one, so we want to have time enough to do that next week. And then the following week is when we're going to have our on-campus exam, exam number 3. So what we want to do is, like usual, look at what we're expecting in terms of our pace for lecture and look at what we're seeing for lab. For lecture, like we said, 10, you should be probably already into 10, and then spending more time of your time with Chapter 11 this week with endocrine. And then cardiovascular comes next week, but then Thursday the 18th is when we have our 3rd exam. And do remember that exam is on campus and it is occurring at 6 p.m., not 8 p.m. We said that the labs go hand in hand with the things that we're covering. So we already did skeletal muscle physiology. The one for this week is endocrine system physiology, which is going to overlap well. And then the last 2 have to do with cardiovascular physiology. So in terms of quizzes for this time, we should have 2 quizzes like usual. But I think what I'm going to do is, because Chapter 10 is relatively small, I think what we'll do is the next quiz, we'll have it cover endocrine and the muscle chapters. So we'll have them cover those 3 chapters. And we won't do it until next week. We'll have it due next week. But I think we'll do those 3 together to make sure that everybody's up on endocrine system before we move into cardiovascular physiology. So let's take a look at what we have in store for us for these chapters. So as I was saying last week, and as I was mentioning this week, Chapter 7 isn't too bad. It really has to do with combining the information that we know, that we learned, with muscular system and that which we were introduced to with the nervous system, and refresh ourselves and get into a little bit more detail in terms of those areas of the brain and the spinal cord that are associated with motor output. Remember, we have sensory or afferent information coming in. We've got our interneurons which process that information in the brain and the spinal cord, and then we have our motor neurons or our efferent neurons coming out. And one of the things that we're going to see is, we've got multiple areas of the brain that are going to be involved with producing these complex movements, and we've got to get those impulses. Once we make a decision about what we want to do, we've got to get those impulses out from the central nervous system as close to where the effector is going to be before we exit the central nervous system. So that's one of the main roles for the spinal cord. It's going to be passing signals up to, afferent signals up to the brain, and then it's going to be passing our motor responses down from the brain, routing them down as low as it can get if it needs to do so, and then exiting via the spinal nerves. Now we will find that the spinal cord, on a very limited scale, can actually act as the control center itself. So you should have seen, or you will shortly see, that some of the very simplified reflexes, a reflex being a very simple muscular response generally, in response to a very simple stimulus, those types of actions or responses can be handled by the spinal cord itself without necessarily involving the higher brain structures. So we'll see that too within this chapter, but not a ton of new information here, just kind of looking at it in a different way. So again, you have images like this that really kind of show you a number of different places in the nervous system, particularly the brain, that are involved with controlling our muscles, right? So we have afferent neurons coming in. We're going to have our motor neurons coming out. The brainstem and the spinal cord is going to be a main relay center, and then the brainstem, as well as higher brain areas, are going to be involved in the process of generating some type of response. And they're going to work together. And so each area is going to have a slightly different function, a slightly different way that it contributes. So when we get to this section, much like when we're in the nervous system as a whole, I think it would be beneficial to maybe have flashcards or something like that so that you could have, one step at a time, an individual brain area and talk about on the back side of the card or something like that the role that it has in controlling or coordinating motor output. So that would be good. I mean, you can do, old-fashioned ones on 3x5 cards and carry them around with you and whip them out every once in a while at your job or standing in line at Starbucks or something like that and kind of go through them. There's electronic ones now where you can go to websites like Quizlet and things like that and create some of your own, or even find some other ones there too. But that's a good way of breaking up this information. So regardless, we see different areas in the brain, like the basal nuclei, like the cerebrum, like the cerebellum, like we were just talking about. And each area has a particular contribution in terms of control of the motor output. Now, another thing that we'll see, though, is that with our output that we have, there's going to be, and we see this with other systems, there's going to be extrinsic or external control that's coming from the central nervous system, but there's also going to be localized control, or at least localized input, and maybe also some control that occur within the organ system or within the organ itself. We saw that with, we'll see that with cardiovascular system. There's a number of systems that do have some sort of localized types of information or reflexes and things like that. So here's, as we talked about afferent, when we're completing that loop, sensory information about these effectors, about these muscles, needs to be fed to the central nervous system. So whether they're contracted, whether they are relaxed, whether they are pulled tight and slim, or whether they are fat. So there are different types of receptors, like Golgi tendon organs that are looking at tension, like the spindle fibers and things like that that are wrapping the individual muscle cell fibers, tell you whether they're contracted or not. These types of receptors are very important in getting the feedback to the central nervous system to figure out, to enable the central nervous system to make a decision on what needs to be done. Now this figure here does a good job of showing you two things. We said that in some cases a reflex may not necessarily involve the higher control centers, that the spinal cord itself may be able to respond. Now, even in very simple reflexes like the withdrawal reflex and things like that, or the cross-tensor reflex, those types of things, a lot of the action, a lot of the response is generated at the spinal cord level. And so, if you look at some of these pathways, here's a sensory neuron coming in, right? We see a unipolar neuron here. We see it coming into the spinal cord. But you can see there's a lot of different synapses located, and neural pathways that are designated by those letters there that show that even this one sensory input can have numerous effects on other neurons. Now, the purple ones here are going to be motor neurons. So in this case, you're seeing a monosynaptic response, where the afferent or sensory neuron creates a synapse with a motor neuron that goes then straight back out in terms of generating a response. You also see in some cases, in a lot of cases, an interneuron that you see there in red. So the interneuron is going to have some sort of role where it's going to mitigate or help to control the response. So it may split the signal or something like that. It may route it to a particular area. But the interneurons is the simplest level of control center. And then, those we see leading to outputs, but we also see that there's going to be continued relay of sensory information up to the brain. And so even with a very simple reflex, like you're at the doctor's office and he hits you in the knee and stuff like that, and your leg jerks out, even at that point right there, you have some sensory information that goes up to the brain. And so it tells you what's going on so that you're aware that these actions have been performed too. And that's what we see with the green pathway there, with the excitatory pathway. Now, the interneurons in this case are giving us the ability for the action to occur. But with our muscles, remember, we have things like prime mover or agonist, and then we have these other muscles or muscle groups that are called antagonists. And on one hand, we need to stimulate our agonists or our prime movers to produce an action. We need to make sure that the antagonists are relaxed so that we can allow that action to occur. So again, you can see some of the effects or some of the results of the neural pathways and the use of interneurons and things like that. Okay, so we go through some of the different reflexes. We start talking about the different areas again of the nervous system. So cerebral cortex has numerous areas of the frontal lobe that are associated with movement and with control. So for instance, we've got the primary motor cortex here, which is the gyrus that is just anterior to the central sulcus, which goes through there. We've got the supplementary motor cortex as well. And so these different areas, primary motor cortex, premotor area, supplementary motor cortex, all have a role to play in making sure that our intended actions actually are realized. So this just, again, goes through and describes some of these different areas. Parkinson's certainly is an example of when this motor response goes awry. Goes through some of the things that we know about Parkinson's and some of the things that are still yet to be learned. Cerebellum is also an area of the brain, that walnut-shaped structure on the back side, on the posterior side of the brainstem, is another critical area of the brain that's involved in coordinating muscle activities. Other things, relays. So, you know, with the spinal cord, like we mentioned, the spinal cord can do very simple reflexes, but we do a lot of relays through it. So we're going to have afferent pathways coming up. We're going to have efferent or motor pathways coming down. So the descending pathways are those that are rising from motor areas of the brain and then going down the spinal cord to exit at the appropriate places. And what we'll find is that some of these pathways will go and be routed to particular areas. We find that there is a couple different pathways that they can go through, the corticospinal pathways or the brainstem pathways. And this, within the pyramids of the medulla oblongata of the brainstem, is where you actually get some of that exchange or crossover, where we get the pattern that you've heard of before, where the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa. So some of those pathways will cross there in the corticospinal pathways with the pyramids, and the brainstem pathways are those that are ipsilateral. They're basically on the same side as opposed to contralateral. Okay, so posture and things like that. You can't do these types of things if you've had a few drinks, and alcohol certainly has a direct effect on the activities of the cerebellum, which works to coordinate muscle activities, maintain posture, works with the inner ear for equilibrium, etc. So hopefully that's not the case for you guys tonight when you're sitting down. All right, so like we said, a fairly short chapter for Chapter 10 works to tie in what we knew with nervous system with what we were learning with muscular system to put a package together there. The next chapter is bigger and more important than that. Okay? The next chapter is endocrine system. And endocrine system is one of our two systems of the body that are about management. Right? We already went through nervous system, which is the wired system, which has direct pathways from it to the effector in order to get it to perform. The endocrine is our wireless system. So in summary, some of the high points that we're going to see for endocrine system is we're going to see the overview of the entire system, you know, kind of how it works and things like that, what are the components and things, much like we did with nervous system. But much like we did in nervous system and any of these systems, we've got to get down to an organ or a cellular level in order to understand how this system does its job. Now, endocrine glands are going to be different than many of our other organs, and similar in some ways to things that you've learned like in anatomy. So you learned about glands before. So what are some glands that you guys learned about in anatomy or had even heard of, you know, even if you haven't taken anatomy? So what are some other types of glands that you have around the body? Adrenal gland. Adrenal gland is an excellent example. Now that's part of the endocrine system, certainly counts. But what about some glands that are not part of the endocrine system as well? So we can do some kind of comparisons here. So if you live in Arizona and it's hot, you've got some glands that are working for you. Yeah, exactly. So you've got sweat glands, you've got salivary glands, things like that, sebaceous glands. All right, so those types of glands, any of these glands are going to produce secretions, right? But the other examples that we have, like salivary glands and sweat glands, those are what are called exocrine glands. They produce a secretion, it goes into a duct, and it's secreted in the local area. Okay, so like if you're looking at skin models or something like that, there's kind of this core of the gland itself, and then there's a tube or a duct that leads up to the surface of like the skin or something like that. Okay, so that's going to be like a salivary gland or something. With an endocrine gland, they're also going to produce secretions. They're not going to have a duct, though, to conduct, if you will, their secretions. The endocrine glands will rely on the blood. So they're going to dump their secretions, which are hormones, into the bloodstream, and the blood is going to transport their secretions to the target organ. So this gives us this idea of this wireless system, right? The endocrine gland, the organ, the controlling organ, can be very far away from the effector organ, and we don't have to have a direct connection to it, right? We don't have to have that wire like a neuron or a neural pathway. When we look at the endocrine system, it's still going to be a control system, but the effects are going to be a little bit more broad-ranging. They're going to be a little bit longer in duration, because if you dump something into the blood, well, it's going to at some time arrive at your target organ, but it's also going to go around and around and around. It's going to end up a whole bunch of other pathways. So those hormones end up in the system a long time on a relative scale, right? Not like milliseconds like the neurotransmitters and things like that. And so we usually see longer types of effects. So you see like development and growth and things like that are oftentimes things that are controlled by the endocrine system. All right, so when we're talking about the system, there's going to be some key parts that we need to understand in terms of the endocrine system and how it works. So we said the endocrine glands secrete hormones, but the question is, what are these hormones made from? We say that they're chemicals, they're like neurotransmitters. Well, when we were talking about neurotransmitters, we went through different types of neurotransmitters. Here we're going to go through chemical classes of hormones instead, and we're going to group them by whether they are water-loving or whether they are fat-loving. You can also say, you know, that these could be hydrophobic as opposed to lipophilic, right? Water and oil don't mix. So that's another critical thing you need to know, is you need to know the categories of the hormones, the chemical categories of the hormones. We need to know kind of how the cells synthesize these different hormones. How do these different glands make these different hormones? What are they made from? What are examples of the different chemical classes of hormones, etc.? Now, based on the chemical structure of the hormone, like we saw, they can be hydrophilic or lipophilic. If they're going to be transported in the blood, they're going to be in contact with the plasma. And the plasma is made mostly of what? Plasma. People are like typing, doing a Google search. It's a fluid in the body, and your body's mostly made up of. You hear this as a stat all the time. What your body's mostly made up of. Vanessa's thinking about it. Nobody? Water. Yes, water. So plasma and the fluids of the body are mostly water. A lot of the tissues are water. The intracellular fluid, the cytosol, etc., is comprised mainly of water. So when you talk about the blood and the cells going around and stuff like that, which we'll get to in the next chapter, plasma is mostly water. So the chemical nature of these hormones, whether they are water-loving or whether they are water-fearing, is very important. So we need to know how these hormones are made. We need to know how these hormones are transported as well, because if they get along with water, then you're good to go, right? No problem there. If you don't, then you're going to need an escort in order to get through this watery plasma to get to your target cell. All right, so this series in here goes through how we make our different proteins, our different hormones, whether they're protein-based or cholesterol-based, etc. So you should know different examples of hormones that are within the chemical classes too. So this just goes through how we make our protein hormones, our amine hormones, our cholesterol hormones, and things like that. This talks about how they are transported in the blood. Like we said, our lipophilic hormones are going to have issues. They're going to need an escort. They're going to need to bind to hormone, or I'm sorry, bind to carrier molecules, which are proteins. And then the hydrophilic ones can actually just be unbound, floating in the plasma, if you will. Now the next thing that we need to know, sorry about that extra line there, the next thing we need to know is if this hormone, if this chemical messenger is going to have an effect on a target cell, well, this is a chemical messenger, right? If you're going to, if this was a verbal message, you would need an ear as the appropriate receptor to hear it, right? Well, this is a chemical message, and so we need the appropriate protein receptor in order to bind it. So the question is, where are we going to find those receptors on these target cells? Now, the target cells are going to have the complementary shaped receptor associated with the cell, and that's why they're going to be activated by that particular hormone. If it's a cell that does not have the correct receptor, then that hormone is just going to go by, and it has no effect on that particular target cell. That's why we can throw it into the blood. We can throw these hormones into the blood, and it can have very specific effects because only the correct target cells with the correct receptors will be able to get that message. So the next thing that you need to be able to compare is where are these receptors located on these target cells. For the hydrophilic hormones, remember that the lipid bilayer has a hydrophobic core to it. So those things that get along with water are not going to be able to get through that plasma membrane. So for water-soluble or hydrophilic hormones, we need to have receptors right on the surface of the cell, on the plasma membrane, to get that message. Meanwhile, if you are talking about lipophilic hormones, those lipophilic hormones are going to be able to get through that plasma membrane with no problem. And so in that case, we're going to have intracellular receptors, receptors that are located within the cell. So we see some differences there. Okay, so you can see the picture. So there is our receptor for that particular hormone located on the surface of the target cell, as opposed to here, where we see a receptor actually inside the nucleus of the target cell, and the hormone is able to reach through, if you will, the cell membrane and get through the nuclear membrane in order to bind with that receptor. Okay, so talk a little bit about second messenger systems and things like that. Talk a little bit about how hormones, we start simple like we did with the neuron. In the neuron, we were talking about, okay, how does one cell relay a message down itself? We talk about action potentials and things like that. Then we said, okay, how do we get that signal from one cell to the next cell? And we talked about synapses and how we get chemical messengers or neurotransmitters across a synapse. And they bind to receptors and things like that. We started out with that, but we learned ultimately that we have neural webs or neural pools where a lot of them will talk to each other through convergence and divergence as opposed to just one cell communicating with one cell, etc. And so we started off talking about individual hormones and what they can do in terms of binding to receptors, but each of those cells is going to have lots of different receptor types, and it can bind a number of different hormones. So there's ways that these hormones can actually interact with each other that we have to understand too, and that's what this goes through. Okay. The next important topic within this chapter, sorry I moved ahead a little bit, is here. So now we know how the endocrine glands create their hormones, how those hormones are transported in the blood, how those hormones will affect cells. But the question is, what starts this process off at the beginning? So what we find is we have three different levels of control inside of the body in order to get these hormones to be released. So what we have is, you can have what's called humoral control. This is also like chemical control. Chemical is a little bit too general though. Then you have what's called neural control, and then you have what's called hormonal control. So humoral control, remember that humor is a fluid, and so what that's talking about is that certain substances like iron or nutrients in the fluids can be monitored by receptors, and when those levels get high or low, that sets off a chemical cascade to cause the hormone to be released in order to fix the situation and maintain homeostasis. So there are a number of examples of that. Neurotransmitters, neural control is a little bit different. Neural control here in the endocrine system is similar to what we've seen in other systems, like the skeletal system, musculoskeletal system. Okay, you actually have a neuron that goes down to the endocrine gland, releases neurotransmitters on it, and gets it to release its hormones. So that's the wired type of control we learned about before. And then there's hormonal control. Now that one seems a little bit circular. But when we say an endocrine gland can manage or control other organs in the body, those other organs may include other endocrine glands. So if we think about the nervous system and the endocrine system as management systems, you got to think about if you have management system at your job, there's different levels of managers as well, right? So there's your shift manager, which tells you what to do. Then there's like the assistant manager that oversees them. There's a store manager that's over them. There's a district manager, et cetera, right? And anything that occurs on any management level above you affects you, right? There's a trickle down. So you can have a high-level endocrine organ like the pituitary gland. It releases hormones that then go down and tell another endocrine gland when to release their hormones. Those hormones come out, and then they end up going down to the target organ, like the muscle or the gland or whatever. So that's what we mean by hormonal control. So you need to know the different controls or how we control hormone release from these endocrine glands. So this just goes through some of those types of examples. The last part of the chapter, which is certainly the larger part of the chapter, on a certain level, is a little bit simpler. I mean, I'm trying to organize it for you so that you can organize your studying and things like that. But the rest of the chapter goes through different endocrine glands in the body, talks about the hormones that they release, and then talks about what those hormones do. Okay? So again, this would be a good place to make your flashcards so that you can have on the front of the card the name of the endocrine gland or the region in the endocrine gland. The hormones that it puts out you can put on the back with the effects of those hormones. Okay? Or you could do the reverse. You could put the name of the hormone on the front. On the back, you put where it's secreted and what it does. All kinds of things. Okay? Now remember, it's going to get down to a cellular level. Individual cells, endocrine cells, are going to be what are secreting the hormones. So even when we have an endocrine gland, we can find that there are specific cells or specific layers or specific regions to an endocrine gland where different hormones are secreted. So here what we see are the adrenal glands. So David had mentioned this before. The adrenal glands are an endocrine gland that sit atop each kidney. And when we look at them, there are 4 different areas to the adrenal gland. There's a cortex towards the outside, the medulla towards the inside, but the cortex is separated into different layers or zones. Zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Now, the colors here help you to see that there are different populations of cells, but if you look over on the right, you can see that there are distinct hormones that are secreted by those different layers, zones, or regions. Okay? So knowing different layers and things like that, or different regions, are going to be important too. But again, flashcards can help to simplify this and break it down. So these slides just go through and talk about what those different hormones do, the role of those hormones in the body. So we get past the adrenal glands, and we get to the pituitary gland. Now when you looked at the adrenal gland, you thought, whoa, I thought it was just one gland, I mean, it puts out what hormone, etc. Now we got cortex medulla, we got different zones. Yes, that is a little bit more complex. And you got to step up as well for the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is kind of a pea-shaped in size almost organ or endocrine gland that hangs off the inferior surface of the brain, right off of the diencephalon or the core of the brain. So the hypothalamus up here has a direct connection to the pituitary gland down there. The pituitary gland sits within the cella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So when you were doing bones back in anatomy, you had that little bat or owl-shaped bone, and it had a little saddle on the back, right, Turkish saddle. This is what's riding in the Turkish saddle. Now the pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland because most of its hormones go down and control other endocrine glands. So that's the master part of it. But it is not the ultimate master. There's always somebody higher than you, and that hierarchy is topped out by the hypothalamus. So there's two parts to the pituitary gland. There's an anterior part and a posterior part, and they are both anatomically and physiologically different. The posterior part is actually also called the neural hypophysis because it's made of neural tissue, and you can see these neurons coming down. The anterior part is actually glandular tissue, but it's still controlled by cells or neurons that are up in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus has direct control over both the anterior and the posterior pituitary, but in two very distinct ways. So now as you go through the pituitary gland, there's going to be more hormones coming out of it, so it's your most complex one. The posterior is a little bit easier, just has two hormones. The anterior is a little bit more complex, 6 or 7 hormones depending on where you read about it. Okay? So you need to know these different hormones that you see here, and you need to know their specific actions in the body. Now this is a little bit kind of simplified, particularly in the fact that the follicle-stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone, also have distinct functions besides their grouping that you see here. But at least this shows you where these what are called tropic hormones are going down and in some cases having an effect on other endocrine glands. Okay, like the thyroid stimulating hormone goes down and stimulates the thyroid gland. The adrenocorticotropic hormone goes down and stimulates the adrenal cortex to release its hormones. All right. Beyond that, we're just doing a tour. We're doing a tour of the different endocrine glands of the body and talking about the hormones they put out. So we look into the thyroid, talk about the different thyroid hormones which are becoming a kind of hot topic in terms of endocrinology and women's problems with malfunctioning thyroids, whether it be hyperthyroid or hypothyroid, things like that. And then, towards the end of the chapter, we get into not specifically just individual endocrine organs, but more of a theme or a topic, a homeostatic topic, where we look at, for instance, something like stress or nutrients or calcium or something like that, and how different endocrine glands and hormones work to maintain homeostasis for that particular factor. So stress is one that comes into play, and we have multiple hormones that will increase and work to kind of moderate stress. So cortisol is being one of them. We're going to have epinephrine and norepinephrine that come up. We're going to have aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, growth hormone that also come up. So in that way, not only do you need to know the individual hormones and what they do, but you also need to know how sometimes they work together to produce a particular function in the body. Growth is another big topic that we look at. That is, as you can think of, a long-term type of process that needs to be regulated. And so there are a variety of different hormones that work together to moderate growth. And you can see a number of them here. Now, growth hormone is going to be a major one, but there are a number of others that come into play as well. Thyroid having to do with metabolism, insulin having to do with nutrient levels, particularly glucose. Sex hormones are involved, usually in terms of starting and stopping some of these processes and allowing other hormones to work. And cortisol has to do with nutrients and stress and things like that. So here we can see those different hormones again, and you can see some of their particular actions and how they have a role in growth, whether it's going from like the baby to the toddler phase, or when you're actually growing in your adolescent years or whatever. The last major topic that we look at is calcium homeostasis and what hormones are involved and their particular role. And much like we were talking about how muscles have agonists and antagonists and things like that, what we find is that this is a good example, and there are other examples, of how the endocrine system, like the nervous system, may have antagonistic types of components that work to very precisely control the actions of target organs and the particular way that we can moderate or maintain adequate levels of nutrients or ions or whatever. So calcium is pretty important. It's important in the nervous system, it's important in the muscular system, it's important in the skeletal system, etc. And we need to be able to control how much calcium we have around. There's two major hormones that do so. One is parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin is another one that has an antagonistic effect. So as you read about it, these two hormones are working against each other. You'll find out that one of these, as suggested by the slide, is much more important in day-to-day calcium regulation compared to the other one, but they work antagonistically. Now this one here, vitamin D, is also a hormone that has a role, direct role in terms of calcium metabolism. And you can see some of the effects down here. So parathyroid hormone and how it works to maintain calcium levels in the body. Okay, so now, like I said, the endocrine system is a fairly complex system, not quite as bad as nervous system, I wouldn't say. There's a lot of organs that contribute to it, though. But hopefully tonight I was able to kind of show you and highlight some of the important areas and topics and kind of organize it in your mind so that as you're going through it, you can focus on those types of things and making sure that you have, solid knowledge or answers in each of those different categories and ways that you can describe it, ways that you can compare and contrast and things like that. So any questions on what we were going over and seeing tonight? Yes, no, maybe so. No votes or anything? Yes or no? You guys are so quiet tonight. You can hear me out there, right? Hello. Oh, there's a couple no's. Megan actually has her hand raised. I'm not sure whether that means she has a question or whether she was just giving a response there. And Monique's typing. No worries. Just making sure. All right, well, I see that Monique is typing there, so we'll see what she has to say. But that's what I have planned for tonight. Like usual, make sure that you have a regular pace of getting stuff done. Cardiovascular system is a big chapter. There are other textbooks that separate cardiovascular system into 2, if not 3 different chapters. So we've got a lot of stuff to be looking at coming up. So you want to make sure that you've got endocrine system down underneath your belt as we go into next week. So for sure, as you listen to the lectures, the archived lectures, as you attend the discussion sections, that's what I'm trying to do, is that I'm trying to highlight the important areas. So the lecture gives you more content of those particular important areas, but here I'm just trying to, again, stress particularly important areas, kind of organize it, highlight it, answer questions, things like that. So yes, you should definitely focus on those areas. And if you have any questions as you're going through and you wonder, is this important, go ahead and shoot me an email. Now, one thing to note as we're going forward, we're going to use the chapter review questions again to help us prepare, and the answers are online. But I also have, in this case for exam 3, I do have, I think, an exam objective sheet, which are, they're similar questions, but maybe just formed in a different way or whatever. Again, something else that you can use to help test yourself and see where you are. In terms of the paper exam, the on-campus exam coming up on the 18th will be the exact same structure. So we've got, 30, 35 multiple choice questions, each worth 2 points. You've got a 10-point lab section that's going to have questions drawn from the Physio-X exercises, and then the rest of them are going to be short answer questions, usually 4, 5, 6 points each or something like that. Timed for sure. They're all timed. So for the on-campus exam, Dr. Jan Johnson, one of our other faculty at Moorpark, is going to be proctoring the exam. She's also an anatomy and physiology professor, and so she can be there to answer any questions that you may have. Other questions? David says, so what labs should we be done by now? Muscular and endocrine this week. Exactly so. Cardiovascular, we got 2 labs associated with the cardiovascular system. Certainly you can wait to do those until after you kind of jumped into cardiovascular. Yep. So, as we get closer to the exam, I'll give you more reminders about what you need to bring, etc. But the Scantron 882 form, which is the kind of blue-green one, 50 questions on the back, or on the front and back, that's the form that you'll need to bring. So yeah, I'll send you reminders, and we'll talk about reminders as we get closer. Okay? So study guide for the on-campus exam, like I was just mentioning, should be up there. We're still going to use the end of the chapter questions and stuff like that, but there should also be a study guide that's on there. And so it'll say exam objectives, exam 3 or something like that. So those are additional questions. And quiz, we'll have a quiz. I'll put an announcement and I'll send out an email about it. We'll have it probably middle of next week, because I want you guys to have time to get into and study up on endocrine system and the other two muscular-related chapters. It'll cover those first 3 chapters, but I want you to have a chance to get into and cover endocrine system before we get it up there. So no quiz this weekend, but we'll have a quiz next week. And I'll let you know specific dates and times it's open. All right. Well, like usual, I'll hang out for a couple minutes in case you guys have other questions. Other than that, make sure that you're staying up to things and let me know if you have questions or things that I can help you with.